Thank you, Keaton. Remember that part of I first heard the words. It's kind of central to all that we're talking about, of hearing words. So I'm Dr. Marty Folsom, and I am the chancellor of the seminary here and the curator of the art gallery. I love creativity, I love thinking, I love engaging people with the life of God and the life of relationships. There's so much I could say, but not today. That's a good start, though. Because today we're going to continue talking about the greatest story ever told. And I think it's easy to think of this story as a story that's somebody else's story. It's that story of the Bible. It's a story that you kind of observe from a distance. But I want to suggest to you, this is your story. And this is finding our place within what it is that God's been doing and the people who are actually your distant relatives. They're the people who've gone before us, who've made it possible for us to be here today. So when we start living into our story, then there's all the fun of discovery. Wow, what is it that they opened up? What is it that they discovered that opens the doors for us today? Today we're looking at Samuel. He's not actually here. I invited him, but he couldn't show up. We also don't have Uncle Sam here. That's another Samuel. Uncle Sam. Okay, we're awake. That's good. Thank you. Just need to make sure everybody's present. So, some people say I get complicated when I talk. So the simple message when you're done is this idea. Both in Samuel's time and in our time, we live in challenging times because there are so many things that become illusions that distract us from what is reality. And so today we're trying to get a sense of what does it mean to make contact with reality. Now we could do a survey to see how you're doing with that reality piece right now, but we'll save that till after the service out on the patio. So, how do we contact reality? In the Western tradition that we live in, pretty much reality is something we see. I'm looking at you, you're looking at me. I'm looking at you, looking at me. We're looking at each other. And we might think, this is reality, it's just what I see. And then you go to a magician show and you see them do things and you go, I know what I saw, but what did I see and what didn't I see that I could have seen if I was that magician who has all kinds of tricky things that they do, so that seeing is not always believing, but we really have this sense, if you're going to be a good scientist, you have to observe, and ultimately you're observing, you're looking at the world, it's going to give you reality. And so I'm going to suggest that may be problematic. It's something like what somebody once called being periscope head people. You know a periscope on a submarine? You get a look at reality, but you're not engaged in reality. You're observing it from a distance. And so at some level, when we are taught to just look at the world and observe it, it leaves us separated, one step distant. We're not really participating in what's going on. And what we see, we often just categorize. Oh, that's that kind of person. Oh, that's that kind of an experience. I don't want to do that because I know what that's like. And maybe we don't. But we're not engaging in reality. So the nature of reality in the biblical story is using your ears. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one Lord. On we go from there. There are all these exhortations to hear. And here's what hearing does. Hearing allows us to move from simply seeing the world as objects, including people, to being persons who address us and tell us who they are and speak to us about how they feel and know about us. And guess what? Reality is profoundly connected to who we are as persons in that dialogue. And in the Bible, particularly the God who reveals himself to us. So, where we often would say something like, I need to see it for myself to get reality, that leaves each person their own judge, having to experience something, so it becomes a hallmark of an individualistic society. Everybody seeing for themselves. But when we listen, then we live in communities where we hear, where we have parents and grandparents who pass things on. We have doctors who hopefully pass on what they've learned from doctors before them. And we know that they have a long tradition of becoming skilled at what it is they do because they live in a tradition of hearing and listening and being shaped to engage reality. So hearing orients us as persons to live within reality in the way that we were created for. And then we get these people called our parents. Now, some of you have those. Thank you. Some of you wonder, where did they get their ideas from? And why don't they think like me? So I had parents. Hopefully this is no surprise to you. There are some shocking things I may say. That's not one of them. So my dad was born and raised in the family of a Presbyterian minister. When he hit about 70, after he'd been teaching science for about 20 years, he was 50. I'm getting cues from my wife. I'm living in community. I'm listening. My dad converted out of Christianity because science for him was this: if I can't see it, if I can't experiment with it, then I can't believe it. So it was about the time I started a 20-year journey of higher education myself, with this question burning in my head: how do I speak to my dad's world? How do I speak to the concerns where everything that I hear around says God is an illusion, the whole sense that if you're going to be a contemporary, this is the contemporary service, isn't it? If you're going to be a contemporary person, you got to throw out all that God stuff. And I saw that there was a reality to that God stuff that was about what it means to be persons created by God for loving relationships. So I had my dad always in the back of my head, in a sense, raising questions for me. How do I answer him? On the other hand, I had my mother. Now, my mother is one of those big-hearted people who had 6 kids. I'm the 4th of 6 kids, who loved big, had a simple faith. She wasn't a big thinker, but she was a big lover, a big-hearted person. And so there's something about that I said, wow, this feels good. This feels like reality. Like, this is what it's about. This is what it's supposed to be about. And then my dad wrestling with reality. And so I lived in this tension over the years of how do we have a reality that is both thoughtful and also passionate, big-hearted, engages the world of personal relationships. And so that has been my pursuit. And so I think the big question for our time is, how do we live in a reality that includes all of who we are as human beings in a world that has objects, but there's something beyond that? So the context of Samuel's life is not so different from the context of the world that we live in today. They had a big issue with fake news. They had prophets and religious stuff going on all over the place that basically reduced the religious dimension of life to a bunch of self-serving acts and had really not too much to do with God. And they told everybody else, it's just about you getting your needs met. So worship can look like having big parties, lots of sex, all those things that make you feel good, which we won't go into all the terms for all those things, but the fake news is you make yourself happy, or you do things to try and make the gods happy, and life will be good. And in the end, that was all a lie. Fake news, corrupt spiritual leaders, the sons of Eli, who was the priest at that time, when the people would bring the meat to be sacrificed on the altar as an act of worship, they had this southern barbecue thing going, and they knew good filet mignon, and they did not want it overcooked. So tell you what, before you do your sacrifice, give me some of that filet mignon so I can go have a nice barbecue, and then you won't ruin the meat. And they're going, but we brought this for God. Yeah, God, don't need him. Filet mignon, give it, now, must have. That's the sons of Eli in a nutshell. Or meat wrap, maybe, as the case may be. So, corrupt religious leaders who were using religion to get their own needs met, right? Religion that collapses into human needs. They took the technology of the time and used it for their own national ends. And you may be going, technology? Have you heard about computers in the Bible? No cell phones? They had this thing called the Ark of the Covenant. And the people, when they saw their enemies come, they said, hey, ark, powerful God. We'll use that. We'll take that with us, and God will be on our side. You know, you could almost make a movie about this. Oh, they did. That's right. What was that movie called? Raiders of the Lost Ark, right? So it's a modern story of exactly what was going on here. Hey, this helped them defeat their enemies in the past. Let's take it and use it for our ends so that if we have it with us, it will be the technology to defeat them, right? We're going to use God's stuff to get our nation's needs met. Well, that didn't work out too well. And there's a whole other story on that with God's bowing down to the ark and things like that. People dying, golden rats. And anyway, that's a whole other story, the golden rat and things like that. There's so much exciting stuff here. Political leaders. There was a hope placed in political leaders at that time saying, we don't need God anymore. We want real leaders who will take our national interests, and we'll have a king like everybody else has a king who will lead us to victory. Today we call them presidents and stuff, but basically hoping in humans rather than in God. It was a problem of their time, it's a problem of our time. In all this, there was a rampant individualism, meaning everybody was basically looking out for themselves, looking through their own eyes at what was right in their own eyes, because they lost the hearing piece and they got stuck in the eye piece. I don't know if they had glasses or not, but when that happens, everybody ends up not listening to God, only listening to himself, and the very fabric of God's work starts to unravel. And that's what was happening. In the end, God gets forgotten or sidelined, and you just enter into cycles of sinful living that ultimately destroy the nation. And that's the history of the book of Judges, is these cycles of sin, and God sending somebody when it gets really bad to deliver them, and then they just start back into it again. So Samuel, in the middle of this, comes along prepared as a revolutionary scientist. You're going, scientist? Scientist? So here's what a scientist is. A scientist is somebody who observes the world or engages the world to understand what it's like and then learns how to reflect on it so that we live attuned to it. So if you're in the biological sciences, you learn about the ocean. What is the ocean like and how do we take care of it? What's going on here? It's not just something, oh, water, wet. Write that down so everybody knows water's wet. Stars. How does the earth work? How does light work? How does all of this work so that we can understand what it means to work with the nature of reality? So good scientists are explorers, discoverers who are constantly trying to understand the nature of the world so that we can work with it. There's one big problem in our modern form of science is that we only study the world as objects, because objects don't kick and fight back. It's the nice thing about rocks is they don't kick you unless somebody throws it at you. So scientists say, we can only do objective study, meaning no personal opinion or involvement in our conclusions. Impersonal study is the nature of modern science. So what have we left out there? Persons. Impersonal science means that we can't study persons. And so you can study a person as an object. You can put them in categories as an object, but you can't really treat them as a person, a uniquely created, wonderful person who's not able to be reduced to a laboratory experiment. Though some people have tried that as well. So the nature of Samuel as a scientist is he reoriented the nation of Israel to be restored back to what is really real. Where do we listen to what is most critical in the world? And that was to be reoriented back to God. Now, the story of Samuel is the story of somebody who is a bit unusual. His mother had a father, actually his mother had a husband. And also, that husband had another wife. So 2 wives, 1 husband. There were some problems with this. The one who was not Hannah had lots of children, and Hannah had no children. So there developed something that you would call animosity. And especially when the one who has a bunch of children goes, nah, 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 look at all my kids. Where are your kids, Hannah? Oh, that's right, you're barren. You're worthless. My kids, on the other hand. And so over time, you can imagine this would get more than wearying. It led Hannah to desperation. And where did she turn in her desperation? She sought reality. She sought God. And so she prayed, and God gave her a son. And his name is Samuel because it means God answered. God heard. God's ear is open to me when I cry out. The nature of the cry that came is one that led her to say, I'm going to, when this child is old enough, I'm going to dedicate this child for the rest of its life to serve in the sanctuary of the Lord. That's a pretty big thing, isn't it? Now, I don't know if you've ever held a baby, which I did this last week. My granddaughter, she's not even a month. Is she a month? Just a month. So here's a mother who is saying, I'm so committed to this child as a gift of God. I'm going to give this child as a gift back to God. So when the baby was weaned, which I'm told is somewhere, I've never weaned a baby myself, so I'm lacking in that experience. But what I hear is that the biblical time was about 3 years old. So at 3 years old, to take your baby and say, okay, Eli, oh yeah, you who's failed with your 2 sons, take mine, raise him up in the ways of the Lord. An amazing act of confidence that Hannah has in the God who leads us on. But she did that, and so Eli became parent, so to speak, mentor, leading for this miracle child who came unexpectedly to a barren woman. As Samuel grows, he becomes the last of the judges. The whole period of the judges, which was somewhere between 300 or 400 years, of this cycle. He's the last one because after this we move into the period of the kings. So he marks the end of a season and the beginning of another. He's the first of the prophets, so that Peter in Acts chapter 3 says, likewise, all the prophets who have spoken from Samuel and his successors onward announced these days. So Samuel marks the beginning of prophets, which again, this is not Wall Street prophets. There was a lot more prophet going on here. Prophets are the voices, the speakers for God so the people can listen. So from this time on, God gave this speaking life to the people through Samuel. He was instrumental in the anointing of 2 of the 3 kings that ever ruled over a united Israel. So that would be Saul and David the great king. And he himself was from the tribe of Levi and was considered a great priest. But the greatest contribution of all of Samuel was that he listened well. All of his leadership roles meant nothing without his ability to listen to the living God. So in this time of corruption with Eli and the sons who ended up dying, all the family died on the same day. It was a bad day, but it was the direct result of their having abandoned the reality of who God was. So regaining contact with the reality, first of all, means we have to return to the living God. And so God himself says in 1 Samuel chapter 2, I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who will do according to what is in my heart and my soul, and I will build him an enduring house, and he will walk before my anointed always. So here God says, I am going to bring reality back. I'm going to have a person, a real living person. I'm going to set them in place, and they will serve me as the one who will bring my people home. So in the time of blurred reality, where everybody's confused about what's real, Samuel shows up, but Samuel was not looking for God. He's not one of those great heroes of the faith who had a long journey of trying to find God. But when God shows up, he pays attention. And I want to suggest that's what good science does. When reality shows up, you pay attention. And that's the case with Albert Einstein. He said, there's something about this all, the way the world works, that Newton has said it's all a big machine, but I don't see a machine here. There's something more going on. I'm going to pay attention. I'm just going to listen to what's going on. And for Einstein, that proceeding with wonder, as he called it, opened up what we would call the Einsteinian revolution, understanding all kinds of things that I'm not going to try and describe to you today. But to say without him, we wouldn't have GPS, we wouldn't have lasers, we wouldn't have all kinds of things because he listened to reality. So I want to suggest science, both with Samuel and with Einstein, is living in the light of the reality that's there, beginning with the God who acts. And Einstein acknowledged a personal universe, a God. And not just the physical world, but also the personal world. So Jules Verne wrote a book with Captain Nemo. Does anybody know Captain Nemo? I also invited him here today, but also Captain Nemo would not show up. Captain Nemo, at the end of his life, was talking about all the things he had done wrong, and he says to this person, you judge me, tell me whether I've done right or not. And the response that came was, all great actions return to God, from whom they are derived. This is contact with reality. You want me to judge you? I can't. You've lived a life. God gave you life, and all of them ultimately came from you. Your very life came from him. That God will be the judge, and all things ultimately return to him, and that God makes good with things. So Samuel the priest is a scientist who brings Israel back to the personal God instead of the experience that they were looking for that satisfied their desires and means and ends. So entering into this world of the personal, a personal God, living with other persons with faithfulness and fidelity, this is what reality is all about, our personal world. Attuning ourselves to the nature of God, to tune my heart to sing thy praise, is sang in Come Thou Fount, which is a whole story with that song too, which is quite interesting. Somebody who had really got it, years later, somebody said, didn't you write that song? And he had also himself drifted. He says, oh, to once again be where I was then, to have my heart tuned to where I was then. And again, this sense of that was reality, that felt like reality. So here, faith, I want to suggest to you, is big science. It's all of science. It's all of God, all of the world that God creates and sustains and makes to have meaning and life and purpose. Big science is all of that together, but you got to get the first point right. And so, darkest times then, maybe dark times now, but a time full of possibility. And so what happens with Samuel is, there he is sleeping one night, as sometimes happens to people. You're still there, good. Now, sometimes I hear that there is some kind of a beast in the room that awakens my wife with some kind of a noise, otherworldly noise. I'm not sure what that is, but I hear it's true. I just wake up for, I don't know what reason it is. Maybe I ate too late or whatever. But when I do, I lay there for a while, and I always go to this prayer. Lord, what have you to say to your servant? And it ties into what we're going to see right here. So in chapter 3, verse 7, it begins, now Samuel did not yet know the Lord. So not knowing means didn't know anything, nothing to seek after, not in contact with any of that. Nor had the word of the Lord yet been revealed to him. So the Lord called to Samuel again. I have to stop here and say this has actually happened twice before in the last 15 minutes for Samuel, where he's heard this, Samuel, Samuel. Except it sounded much more cool than what I can do. He'd heard his name. He thinks it's Eli down the hall calling for him. Must be time for a midnight snack or something. And so Eli then discerned, he rose, went to Eli and said, here I am, for you called me. And Eli discerned that the Lord was calling the boy. And Eli said to Samuel, go lay down, and if he calls you, say, speak, Lord, for thy servant is listening. So Samuel went and lay down in his place, and the Lord came and stood and called as the other times, Samuel, Samuel. I'm trying to be nice to your ears there. Last night I woke up everybody in the place because I didn't realize how loud it gets if you put it right here. And Samuel said, speak, for thy servant is listening. This is the point of contact with reality. It's a heart and an ear that is open to hear, that's ready to receive. And so when I pray in the middle of the night, I don't ever hear an audible voice. I know you're disappointed. You'd think, a great theologian like him, if anybody's going to get it, certainly it's him. But I have not had God come and speak to me in the middle of the night in an audible way and then go and ask my wife if she called me or anything like that. Cooper, maybe so. That's the old lab. He calls sometimes for me. But I always go to this place when I'm laying there, not falling back asleep, where I say, Lord, here's your servant. What do you have to say to your servant? And it's in that place that I'm in the best place to hear. And I hear all kinds of things that go into my writing and even my sermon preparation or a relationship that I'm going to be engaged in the next day. And the time that I've spent in Scripture, the time that I've spent in prayer for my whole life, I can tell the difference between when he says, go buy that Cadillac, versus be gentle with that person tomorrow. They're hurting. I can discern, that's your voice. That's what you need your servant to do. And so I can be led because I have a point of contact with the reality of a God who speaks to me. Now, the other thing I want to point out here is God speaks first. Samuel doesn't go looking, so God is the initiator. It's not about us going to find God. It's being open to the God who's already speaking. And what is the one word that he uses there? Twice? His name. God knows Samuel's name. And guess what? God knows your name too. Possibly the most important first point to get in contact with reality is to recognize that there is a God who knows your name, who wants to speak to you, to affirm you, and to love you. So if you, in the middle of the night, hear just even a voice in your head that says, I know you and I love you, Linda. If you're not Linda, don't hear it. But if your name fills in that blank spot, to say, this is reality. I know you and love you, Cindy. To be able to begin to open up, I am known and I am loved and you know my name, is a starting point for contact with reality. We are contextualized in the very relationship that gives us life. Now there's a whole other story of the world that's out there that says the whole of the universe, it's all just chance. We can talk about some of how it's changed, how it's improved. But if I ask somebody with this alternate story, do you know where the universe came from? Well, there was a Big Bang. Yeah, so Big Bang, where did it come from? And the answer is usually something like, I don't know. To which I say, I do. I know the one who created the universe. I know the story that begins that creative work. When we get to the next question, where did life come within this universe that we're not sure where it came from? How do we go from not alive to something that was alive? Well, we're not quite sure. It's a pretty big step up. It's like, well, I know where that came from because there's a living God who creates living things. And the question, how did that living stuff get organized so that it has information systems that we call genes and DNA and all those things that change to develop into other things so that there's adaptation? But how do we get this information system? Because information systems take persons, organizers. So the fact that there's an orderly world, which in fact science requires an orderly world to do the work of science, you don't know where that orderly system came from, but I do. It's the God who orders the universe, who puts it together, who holds all things together. And then when we get to that point where we become like we are, where we become conscious beings, some of you are on the edge of unconsciousness, maybe at this point. But you're conscious that you're almost unconscious. That consciousness is something, there was a TED Talk I listened to the other day where in the end he said, science doesn't know where it came from. My theory is that the whole universe is filled with consciousness. And that what we have in becoming humans is just an outworking of that. And I'm going, well, I know that consciousness, and he actually has a name. And he knows your name. And we are called in our touching reality, our contact with reality, by knowing the one who gives us a consciousness of the other, of God, of each other, of the world we live in. On we could go with all the things that can't be answered by science, but the answer of who God is the ground of our reality, answers every one of them, and brings us to this meaningful, knowing, loving relationship for which we are made. So I want to suggest good science begins with God. It studies all that God has made, including the physical world, and us as persons, and God. Good science includes all that, the whole of the actual world. So that a true prophet, in the end, a true prophet needs to not just have a lot of God jargon. They have to re-engage us with reality, God and the whole world, and one another, and the communities we live in, and the families we live in. A true prophet always calls us back to reality. We become reality-focused. And so in 1 Samuel chapter 3, thus Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fail. This growing into the world, and the Lord gave him words for hearing and speaking, and all Israel from Dan even to Beersheba knew that Samuel was confirmed as a scientist of the Lord. It says prophet there, but scientist is somebody who studied and listened to God so that they could reveal reality to everyone who listened. The Lord appeared again at Shiloh because the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of the Lord. There is the touch point with reality. So a prophet calls people from all their inadequate thinking and acting to once again live within the personal realm, personal relationship with God and one another. This reorientation is God reality. It is a dismissal of all the false religious ways that people try and get to God by performing for God, by doing things that are just religious but really have very little to do with God. All of that Samuel removed, and we are called to remove those false ways of being. It was a removal of inadequate political leaders, either removing them in the case of Saul or correcting them in the case of David, whose heart was right, but he had a few flaws, but God still worked with him and lived within that reality. When, as a judge, Samuel led Israel to overcome their enemies, they built up a memorial, a remembering stone, and it's called an Ebenezer, a stone of help. God helped us this far. So to build into the science of their memory, we need to remember whenever we get in trouble, God is our help. God is our Ebenezer, which is not the same thing as Ebenezer Scrooge, in case you were wondering. So the nature of what it looked like to build into the memory of the people are using art forms to remind and to draw us back to reality. That's part of what Samuel did also. So living with science and theology together, we make contact with reality. And so the great scientist Albert Einstein said, "The unleashed power of the atom has changed everything, save our modes of thinking, and thus we drift towards unparalleled catastrophe." We've discovered something about the physical world, but we've gotten so disoriented that it's all falling apart. He also said we should take care not to make the intellect our God. It has, of course, powerful muscles, but no personality, meaning it's missing the whole dimension of the personal. It's missing God. We've got a lot of knowledge, but the point of reality with God that guides and directs it, that is the point of contact we need. Towards the end of C.S. Lewis's book, The Silver Chair, the children have been searching for a lost king, and they're taken into an underworld where the Green Queen basically is seducing them, particularly one point with her magic spells and a green kind of stuff that burns on the fire. And she starts telling them, there's no overworld, there's no trees, there's no rivers and sun. What fun stories you make up. And slowly by slowly begin repeating back all of the things she's saying. It's all a dream. That's not real. There comes a point, though, where Puddleglum, who is a marshwiggle, and you all know what a marshwiggle is, right? So a marshwiggle lives in a marsh, and they actually eat a lot of marsh stuff, and so they kind of smell like, look like, and taste like marshy stuff, muddy stuff. Puddleglum, who's a bit of an Eeyore, takes one last stab and sticks his muddy foot into the fire where the magic spell stuff is going on. Suddenly the room smells like mud. It smells like all that dirt stuff instead of the sweet magical stuff that the witch was using to seduce them. And Puddleglum speaks up, one of the great things that C.S. Lewis ever wrote. "One word, ma'am," he said, coming back from the fire, limping because of the pain. "One word. All you've been saying is quite right. I shouldn't wonder. I'm a chap who always liked to know the worst and then put the best face on it. So I won't deny any of what you've said. But there's one more thing to be said, even so. Suppose we have only dreamed or made up all of those things, trees and grass and sun and moon and stars, even Aslan, who's the Christ figure, even Aslan himself, suppose we have. Then all I can say is that in that case, the made-up things seem a good deal more important than the real ones. Suppose this black pit of a kingdom of yours is the only world. Well, it strikes me as a pretty poor one. And that's a funny thing when you come to think of it. We're just babies making up a game, if you're right. But 4 babies playing a game can make a play world which licks your real world hollow. That's why I'm going to stand by the play world. I'm on Aslan's side, even if there isn't any Aslan to lead it. I'm going to live as like a Narnian as I can, even if there isn't any Narnia. Contact with reality. Puddleglum woke them up. So contact with reality says this. We need to see through all the fog of the messages, of the media, of the politicians, of the marketers, through all of that and get down to the real God, to see the way through it all to real life with God, with one another, to focus on the Jesus who comes to show us the Abba, who calls us by name, to know that the Spirit wants to speak to us so that we hear, so that we listen to the voice of the living God, that we might, in the night or in the day, learn to cry out, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." Let's pray. We do thank you, our God, that you are immense and huge and you hold the universe together, and yet you are personal and present. You know each of us. You speak to our hearts. You see our challenges, our joys, our hopes, our disappointments. And today, in this moment, we just pray that you would help us to get grounded in knowing that you know our names, that you love us and know us, and that you desire for us to live in that reality that you give us in yourself, so that as we go from this place, that reality would shape the life of joy and self-giving because we are with you. We've made contact with the personal reality that you are. Do this, we pray, in your name, you who is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.